The baby stopped breathing, and 5 ambulance workers surrounded the small body with their hands moving quickly and their voices sounding worried and scared. But nothing they tried was working, and Emma Davis stood in the shadows watching because she had seen this happen before 8 years ago, when her little brother Michael had the same blue lips and the same terrible moment of death, but this time she knew exactly how to save him. And if she spoke up she would lose everything she had worked for. But if she stayed silent and said nothing, the little boy would die, and she only had a few seconds to decide what to do. And 6 months earlier Emma had walked through those big metal gates carrying one bag and 1,000 sad memories because she wasn't looking for a brand new life but instead she was running away from her old one. And Riverside, Washington was a city filled with tall glass buildings and rich people who worked with computers and technology. And it was the kind of place where people asked about what skills you had and not about your sad story. And it was a place where you could disappear into the background and fade away and nobody would care why you were there. And that's exactly what Emma needed because she needed to disappear and hide from her past. And the job was simple because all she had to do was clean the house and cook meals when they needed her to and stay quiet and not bother anyone. And the billionaire who owned the huge mansion traveled all the time for his business. And his wife had died 2 years ago, which was very sad. And there was a little boy who was 2 years old and a babysitter who took care of him and a few other people who worked at the house. And Emma didn't ask them any questions about their lives and they didn't ask her any questions either, which was absolutely perfect for what she needed. But houses like that big mansion always hold secrets inside them. The kind of secrets that sit heavy in the air like a weight you can feel, the kind you sense and feel before you actually see them with your eyes. And the babysitter had hands that shook all the time and eyes that never looked calm or rested. And the older woman who ran the entire house moved like she was protecting and guarding something dangerous. And the man who took care of the gardens and lawn barely spoke at all. And when he did talk his words sounded like he had practiced them over and over. And Emma noticed all of this but she said nothing about it. Because she had her own secret, which was a green bottle hidden in her room wrapped in cloth and filled with something her grandmother had taught her to make during the week after Michael died. And she had carried that bottle for 8 years, moving from city to city and from job to job, and it was a weight she couldn't put down no matter how hard she tried, and she told herself over and over that she would never need to use it again. That the special knowledge she carried inside her heart, the thing that could have saved her brother if only she had known it sooner, would stay buried with him in his grave. But God doesn't waste our pain and sadness. And instead He hides it, and shapes it, and saves it for the exact moment when it's needed most. And in 6 months that moment would come on a warm sunny afternoon when a child would suddenly collapse and fall down, when professional ambulance workers would fail to save him. When a father would scream for someone, anyone, to please save his son, and Emma, invisible Emma who nobody noticed, would have to make a choice between the shadows she had learned to live in and hide inside and the bright light that might completely destroy her life. And before we begin this story, please subscribe and like this video and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because sometimes God hides us in the darkness just long enough to prepare us and get us ready for our special purpose in life. And 6 months earlier the rain had just stopped falling when Emma reached the big metal gates. And she stood there for a long moment just staring up at the enormous house on top of the hill that was made of glass and steel with clean straight lines. And it was the kind of place you see in fancy magazines and you think that people don't really live in houses like that. But they actually do. And her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she checked the address one more time. And this was definitely the right place, and she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder because everything she owned in the whole world fit inside that one bag, which included a few shirts and a pair of jeans and a photo of Michael that she kept hidden at the bottom and the green bottle that she always carried, always the bottle no matter where she went, and the intercom on the gate crackled with static, and a voice said Miss Davis, and Emma said yes, and the voice said service entrance. Come around to the north side of the house, and the gates opened without making a single sound. And Emma walked up the very long driveway, and her old sneakers crunched on the white gravel, and she walked past gardens that looked like someone had painted them, they were so perfect, and she walked past fountains that probably cost more money than her mother's entire house back in Alabama, and she had been running away for 8 years now, first from Alabama to Georgia, then from Georgia to Colorado, then to Oregon. And now she was here in the Pacific Northwest with its rain and mountains and people who didn't ask nosy questions about your past. And she really needed that because she couldn't handle people asking her questions. And at the side entrance of the mansion a woman was waiting for her. And the woman looked like she was in her 50s with sharp eyes that noticed everything and expensive clothes. And she was the kind of person who noticed absolutely everything and forgot absolutely nothing. And the woman said, "I'm Patricia Albright, and I manage this entire household." And her voice was cold and businesslike and efficient. And she said, "You're the new housekeeper." And Emma said, "Yes, ma'am." And Patricia looked her over very carefully, taking in the worn-out bag and the cheap shoes and the quiet, desperate look of someone who really needed this job badly and couldn't afford to lose it. And Patricia said, "Mr. Hudson values his privacy above absolutely everything else." And she said, "You will clean and you will help with meals and you will help with the child when we need you to. But you absolutely do not talk about this family, not to your friends, not on the internet, not to anyone at all." And she paused for a moment and then said the last person who forgot that important rule was gone the very same day. And Emma nodded her head to show she understood, and they walked inside the mansion together. And the house was absolutely beautiful with windows everywhere that showed views of the water and expensive art hanging on all the walls. But it felt cold inside, like a showroom in a store, like nobody actually lived there and enjoyed being there. And Patricia said as they climbed the stairs that Mr. Hudson's wife passed away 2 years ago right after their son was born, and she said he travels constantly now building his company and making it bigger, and she said you'll see the boy much more than he ever will. And she said it like it was completely normal, like fathers were supposed to be gone all the time and not spend time with their children. And they reached the 3rd floor where the workers had their rooms, and Patricia opened a door. And inside was a small room with a bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over the beautiful garden, and it was actually the nicest place Emma had stayed in for many years. And Patricia said, "Dinner is at 7 o'clock, and she said don't be late." And then Patricia left and closed the door, and Emma sat on the bed and slowly unpacked her bag, and the photo of Michael went into the drawer where nobody would see it. And the bottle wrapped in a towel went into the very back of the closet where it would be hidden, and she looked out the window at the perfect view of the gardens, but something felt wrong deep in her stomach, and she couldn't name exactly what it was, just a heaviness in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath and waiting for something bad to happen. And that night at dinner she understood why she felt that way, and the staff kitchen was smaller than the rest of the enormous house and quieter, like a place where people had forgotten how to talk to each other normally. And 2 people were sitting at the table when Emma walked in, and there was a young woman who was blonde and maybe 23 years old with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept properly in weeks, and she was pushing food around on her plate but not actually eating any of it. And there was a man who was older with rough weathered hands, and he had the kind of face that had learned that silence and staying quiet was much safer than speaking. And the young woman said, "You must be Emma," and she forced a smile onto her face, and she said, "I'm Jenny and I take care of Brian who is the little boy," and the man nodded his head but didn't speak any words. And Jenny added, "That's Thomas and he manages the grounds and takes care of the gardens and lawn." And Emma sat down at the table. And the food was really good with salmon and roasted vegetables, and it was the kind of fancy meal she hadn't eaten in many years, but nobody at the table was actually eating anything. And Emma asked, "How long have you both been working here?" And Jenny answered really fast like she had practiced saying it, and she said 14 months. And Thomas didn't look up from his plate but said 2 years, and he said he started working here right after Mrs. Hudson died. And Emma asked, "Do you like working here?" And Jenny's smile got tighter and looked more fake, and she said, "Mr. Hudson is very generous, and he expects a lot from us, but he's fair." And something about the way she said those words felt rehearsed and careful, like she was reading from a script, and before Emma could ask any more questions Patricia appeared in the doorway like a ghost, and she said, "Jenny, Mr. Hudson just got home and Brian needs you right now." And Jenny stood up immediately without finishing her food and without saying goodbye, and she just left the room. And the kitchen went completely quiet again, and Emma felt it right then, the heavy weight of all the things that nobody was saying out loud. The sense that everyone in this house was playing a part, and pretending to be something they weren't, and 2 weeks later Emma finally met Brian for the first time, and she was cleaning the nursery when Jenny brought him back inside from playing outside, and he toddled into the room on unsteady little legs, and he had blonde hair and blue eyes and he was so incredibly small. And he saw Emma standing there and stopped walking and stared at her with the kind of complete trust that only children have before the world hurts them, and then he smiled at her. And it was bright and pure and innocent, and he reached his little hands toward her like he wanted her to pick him up, and Emma's heart cracked wide open in her chest because he looked so much like Michael, not in his actual features and face, but in that innocence, and that belief that adults would always keep him safe and protect him. And Jenny said quickly, "Brian, no," and she scooped him up into her arms, and she said, "She's working right now." But Emma saw something in Jenny's face that looked like sadness and guilt and something haunted, and that night Emma couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard she tried, and she kept thinking about Brian's beautiful smile and about the way Jenny's hands shook when she held him and about the way Patricia watched everyone like a hawk watches mice and about Thomas making phone calls in the garage with the door closed. And 3 weeks after Emma started working there she heard something that made her blood run cold. And there were voices that were low and urgent coming from the linen closet near the nursery, and Emma slowed her steps and listened carefully, and she heard Jenny's voice and it was strained and scared, and Jenny said, "I can't keep doing this anymore," and then she heard Patricia's voice and it was cold as ice, and Patricia said, "You don't have a choice in the matter," and Jenny said, "But he's just a baby," and Patricia said, "We've been planning this for 2 whole years, so don't lose your nerve now," and there was silence for a moment. And then Emma heard footsteps coming, and she moved fast down the hall pushing her cleaning cart, and her heart was pounding so hard in her chest, and Patricia stepped out of the closet and saw Emma about 30 feet away down the hall, and their eyes met for just a second, and Emma knew right then that she had heard too much, and she knew that Patricia knew it too, and Emma learned the daily rhythm of the house very quickly after that, and she would wake up before dawn while it was still dark outside. And she would clean everything in complete silence, and she would stay out of sight whenever Mr. Hudson was home, which honestly wasn't very often at all, and she saw him maybe 3 times during that first month, and he was always on his phone talking about business, and he always looked stressed out, and he was carrying a weight that seemed to go beyond just work and business. And when he looked at the framed photos of his wife, who was a beautiful woman with kind eyes, his face would break and look sad for just a second, and then he would turn away and bury himself in work again, running away from his grief and sadness, and Emma thought she understood that feeling because she had been doing the same thing for 8 years. But it was Brian who stayed on her mind constantly, and she wasn't supposed to spend time with him because that was Jenny's job. But when she cleaned the playroom he would be there stacking blocks and playing with toy trucks, and he would look up at her with those bright trusting eyes. And he would say "baby," which was his word for everyone because he was still learning to talk, and every single time Emma's chest would tighten up because he reminded her way too much of Michael. And 1 month after Emma started working there Jenny mentioned at dinner that Brian was sick, and she said, "It's just a stomach thing," and she said kids pick up everything these days. But something about how she said it felt wrong and off, and 1 week later Brian was sick again. And Jenny said it was probably from the play center where kids share germs, and Patricia gave her a sharp look across the table that seemed like a warning, and another week went by and Brian was sick again, and Emma started paying much closer attention to everything, and she noticed that Patricia prepared Brian's bottles personally, every single one of them, and she would do it in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching her. And Emma noticed that Jenny's hands shook really badly when she fed Brian his meals, and she noticed how Thomas made those phone calls in the garage with his voice low but his tone sounding almost hostile, and they all moved like pieces on a chessboard, coordinated and purposeful and planned, and Brian just kept getting sicker and sicker, and one morning Emma was putting away clean laundry in the nursery when she heard Brian coughing, and it wasn't a normal cough, it was deep and painful and scary, and Jenny rushed into the room with her face completely pale. And she whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart," while picking him up, but her voice cracked like she was about to cry, and Emma watched from the doorway, and Brian's color was off and wrong, and his energy was much lower than usual for a toddler, and he had lost weight that she could see, and Emma's old instincts kicked in right then, the ones from before she dropped out of medical school, from before Michael died, from when she was studying medicine and learning to see things that other people missed. And this wasn't just normal childhood illness. This was something else, something deliberate and planned, and that night Emma couldn't sleep at all, and she kept thinking about the pattern of Brian's sickness, about the timing of when he got sick, about the way Patricia controlled absolutely everything Brian ate and drank, about the way Jenny looked guilty every single time she fed him anything, about the way Thomas waited and watched like they were all waiting for something specific to happen. And she thought about just leaving, about walking away before she got tangled up in whatever darkness lived in this house. But then she thought about Brian's smile and his trust and the way he reached for her with those small hands just like Michael used to do, and she said to herself, no, not again. I won't let this happen again. And if something was wrong she would find out what it was even if it cost her absolutely everything she had. And the next morning while Emma was cleaning the kitchen she saw something that made her freeze in place, and she saw Patricia preparing Brian's morning bottle, and Patricia reached into the cabinet and pulled out a small vial, and she measured something from the vial into the formula with careful precision, and then she stirred it slowly and deliberately, and Emma's blood went completely cold, and she moved back into a hallway before Patricia could see her standing there, and her hands were shaking badly. And her heart was pounding so loud she thought everyone in the house could hear it. And that wasn't medicine in that bottle, that wasn't vitamins, that was something else, something dangerous, and suddenly everything made perfect sense, the illnesses, the weight loss, the way they all moved together like they were following a carefully planned script. They were poisoning Brian slowly and carefully, and nobody knew except for Emma, and Emma didn't tell anyone what she had seen because how could she had no actual proof. Just what she had seen for a few seconds through a doorway, just a vial and a hand and something being poured into a bottle, and if she was wrong about this she would lose this job and lose this room and lose this fragile stability she had barely managed to build. But if she was right then Brian was dying slowly, and she was the only person who knew the truth, and the thought haunted her every single night and kept her awake staring at the ceiling, and it made her feel sick to her stomach, and she thought about calling the police. But what would she even say to them? She would have to say, I think the house manager is poisoning a child, and they would ask if she had evidence. And she would have to say, no, I don't have any evidence, and they would ask who she was, and she would have to say, yes, I'm just a maid with a fake resume who's only been here 6 weeks, and they would never believe her story at all. And she thought about telling Mr. Hudson directly, but he was in San Francisco for business, and he was gone for 2 whole weeks. And when he called home Patricia was always the one who answered the phone, and Emma felt completely trapped with no way out. So instead she just watched everything very carefully, and she started writing down and documenting everything she saw, all the days when Brian seemed worse, all the meals that Jenny fed him, all the bottles that Patricia prepared, and she even saved one of the bottles late at night when everyone was asleep. And she took an empty bottle from the nursery and hid it in her room wrapped in a towel, and she put it with the green bottle in the very back of her closet, and she didn't know what she would do with it. But she needed something, anything that might count as evidence, and Brian got much worse as time went on, and his 2nd birthday was coming up soon, and Mr. Hudson was planning a big party with guests and celebration, trying to create something normal in a house that was anything but normal. But Brian barely had enough energy to play anymore, and he would cling to Jenny and whimper when she tried to put him down, and his eyes looked tired, way too tired for a little child. And Emma's heart broke into pieces every single time she saw him because he looked more and more like Michael every day, that same fragility, that same trust in adults who were supposed to protect him but were failing him. And one afternoon Emma was cleaning the living room when she heard Mr. Hudson talking on the phone. And he said, I don't care what it takes, cancel all the meetings, I'm coming home for Brian's birthday. And he said my son needs me there, and his voice cracked with emotion. And he said I've missed too much already and Jennifer would never forgive me for not being there. And Emma's throat got tight because she realized he really did love his son, he was just blind to what was happening, too busy, too far away to see what was happening in his own house right under his nose. And that evening at dinner the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. and Jenny barely touched any of her food, and Thomas just stared at his plate, and Patricia sipped her tea with that cold, calm expression on her face. And Patricia said the party is on Saturday and everything is arranged and ready, and Jenny's fork suddenly clattered against her plate making a loud noise, and Emma asked quietly, "Are you all right?" And Jenny looked up at her, and her eyes were red and exhausted, and for just a moment Emma thought Jenny might say something real, might confess, might break down and tell the truth, but then Patricia's sharp gaze locked onto Jenny, and Jenny looked away quickly, and she whispered, "I'm fine, just tired, that's all." And the lies were suffocating everyone in that room, and Emma lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. And Saturday was coming, the party, with guests everywhere, with Mr. Hudson home, and she could feel that something was going to happen. She could feel it in her bones, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky even changes color. They had been building toward this moment for 2 whole years. And Emma had absolutely no idea how to stop it from happening, and she thought about Michael, about the morning he complained that his stomach hurt, about how she told her mama it was probably nothing serious, about how she went to class that day instead of staying home with him, about how he died that afternoon while she was sitting in class studying, and she had carried that horrible failure for 8 whole years, and she couldn't fail again. She absolutely could not fail another child. But God help her, she didn't know what to do or how to stop what was coming, and Saturday came way too fast. And the weather was absolutely perfect, unseasonably warm for late October, with blue sky and sunlight sparkling on the water like diamonds, and the pool deck was decorated like something out of a fancy magazine with balloons and colorful streamers and a table full of delicious food, and there were 50 guests who were tech executives and their families, and they were all smiling and dressed in expensive clothes, celebrating a little boy's 2nd birthday party, and Emma served champagne to the adults and cleared dirty plates and stayed invisible like always, but her eyes never left Brian for more than a few seconds, and he was wearing a tiny suit and he looked absolutely adorable, but he was pale, way too pale for a healthy child, and he clung to Jenny and didn't want to play with the other children who were running around, and Mr. Hudson held him for a while and kissed his head and tried really hard to make him smile. And he said to a guest 2 years old today, "Can you believe it?" And his voice was proud but also tired, and someone laughed and said he looks just like Jennifer, and Mr. Hudson's smile got smaller and sadder, and he said, "Yeah, he does," and he set Brian down gently on the ground and went back to talking with the investors and business people, trying to be present but already getting distracted by work again, and Emma watched Patricia move through the crowd looking calm and controlled. And Patricia kept checking her watch like she was waiting for something specific to happen, and Thomas stood near the garage with his arms crossed just watching everything, and Jenny hovered near Brian, and her face was completely white, and her hands were shaking worse than Emma had ever seen them shake before, and something was very wrong. Emma could feel it deep in her bones, and the air felt too heavy and too still, like the moment right before lightning strikes during a storm, and Brian toddled toward the kiddie pool because he was fascinated by the water. And he was reaching for a toy that was floating near the edge, and then he stumbled. But it wasn't a normal stumble like when toddlers fall. His whole body went completely rigid and stiff, and he fell into the shallow water with a splash, and Mr. Hudson laughed at first because he thought Brian was just playing, and he started to walk over to help him out. But Brian didn't splash around, he didn't play, his body just seized up. And Mr. Hudson suddenly ran as fast as he could and pulled Brian out of the water, and he was screaming for help, screaming for someone to call 911, and Brian's lips were already turning blue, but not from drowning, from something completely different, and someone in the crowd shouted, "Call 911 right now," and guests scattered everywhere looking panicked, and they were pulling out their phones, and Jenny rushed over with her face frozen in complete horror, and she kept saying, "Oh God," over and over. And Patricia appeared looking perfectly calm and collected, and she said, "Give him space, help is coming," but her eyes told a different story, and Emma saw it clearly. She saw satisfaction in Patricia's eyes, and Emma realized this was the plan, this was exactly what they had been waiting for all along, and the ambulance sirens came really fast, and within just a few minutes 5 paramedics flooded onto the pool deck, and they surrounded Brian's small body and worked with quick precision. And they put an oxygen mask on his face, and attached a heart monitor, and started in 4-line in his tiny arm, but within just a few seconds confusion crossed all of their faces, and one paramedic said his vitals are dropping fast, and another said he's not responding to the oxygen at all, and another said what is this? This doesn't make any sense. And Emma stood behind the crowd watching everything, and she saw Brian's face and the specific discoloration of his skin. It was blue-gray, which was not normal, and she saw the way his little stomach was swollen. And she saw the way his body trembled, and her blood turned to ice because she knew this. She had seen this exact thing before. She had seen Michael on the kitchen floor in Alabama, and she had seen paramedics trying the same exact treatments and failing in the same exact way because they were treating the wrong thing. And this wasn't drowning. This wasn't cardiac arrest. This was FPIS, which stands for Food Protein-Induced Enterocolitis Syndrome. And it's a rare allergic reaction that looks like a lot of other things, but it requires something completely different to treat it, something that only Emma knew how to fix. And the lead paramedic shook his head looking defeated. And he said we need to transport him to the hospital right now, and he said he's not going to make it if we stay here. But Emma knew the terrible truth: Brian wouldn't make it at the hospital either, not if they kept treating the wrong problem. And she knew she had maybe 3 minutes before Brian's organs would shut down completely, just 3 minutes to decide what to do. To stay quiet and keep her head down and let the professionals handle it like she was supposed to, or to step forward and expose everything about herself and save him. And Emma pushed through the crowd of people, and she said, "Wait, please wait," and every single head turned to look at her. 5 paramedics, 50 guests, Mr. Hudson on his knees beside his son, all of them staring at the maid who had spoken up. And the lead paramedic said, "Ma'am, step back please," and his voice was firm but not unkind, and he said, "We're handling this situation," and Emma said, "You're treating the wrong thing." And his eyes got narrow, and he said, "Excuse me," and Emma said, "He's not in cardiac arrest from drowning, he's having a food reaction, it's FPIS, his body is rejecting something he ate or drank, and your normal protocols won't work on him." And the paramedic just stared at her, and he said, "And you know this, how exactly?" And Emma's voice shook as she spoke, and she said, "Because I watched my little brother die the exact same way, with the same symptoms, the same presentation. And nobody knew what it was until it was too late to save him." And Mr. Hudson looked up at her, and his face was completely destroyed and broken, and he said, "Can you save him?" And the paramedic started to say, "Sir, we can't let," but Mr. Hudson interrupted him, and he said, "Can you save him?" And his voice cracked with desperation. And Emma looked at Brian's small body lying there with his lips blue-gray and his chest barely moving up and down, and she thought about Michael, about failing him, about 8 years of running and hiding and wishing she could go back in time and fix everything, and she whispered, "Yes, I think I can save him." And Mr. Hudson turned to the paramedic, and he said, "Let her try." And the paramedic said, "Sir, we have protocols we have to follow." And Mr. Hudson roared, "My son is dying and your way isn't working, so let her try." And there was complete silence on that pool deck, and the lead paramedic looked at Emma, really looked at her, and he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. And he asked, "What do you need?" And Emma said, 3 minutes, something from my room upstairs, and trust. And Mr. Hudson nodded his head, and he said, "Go." And Emma ran into the house as fast as she could up the stairs, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open her bedroom door. And she grabbed the green bottle from the back of the closet, the one she had made 8 years ago, the one she had carried from city to city and from job to job, the one she had prayed she would never need to use again. And it was her grandmother's special remedy combined with what she had learned in medical school before she dropped out, and she ran back down as fast as her legs could carry her. And when she got back to the pool deck, Brian's oxygen levels were dropping, first 74%, then 71%. And Emma knelt down beside him on the hard ground, and she said, "This is activated charcoal suspension with oral rehydration solution and ginger extract." And her voice was steadier than she felt inside, and she said, "For FPIS, the reaction is happening in the digestive system, not in the respiratory system." And she said, "We need to bind the protein trigger and stabilize his electrolytes before his organs fail completely." And the paramedic watched her very carefully, skeptical but listening, and Emma administered the medicine very carefully, not too fast, in small doses, monitoring his response after each one. And the seconds felt like hours ticking by so slowly, and Mr. Hudson gripped the deck railing so tight. His knuckles turned white, and he was praying words that Emma couldn't hear, and 30 seconds went by, then a full minute, and Brian's small body suddenly convulsed once really hard and he expelled fluid from his mouth, and then he convulsed again, and the monitor started changing, and his oxygen saturation went up to 78%, then 82%, then 87%, and his heart rate was stabilizing. And color was returning to his lips, changing from blue-gray to pale pink, and then the most beautiful sound in the world happened. Brian gasped and coughed and cried, and it was weak and small but he was alive, he was breathing, and Mr. Hudson collapsed onto the ground sobbing, and the lead paramedic just stared at Emma with his mouth open, and he said, "How did you, what are you?" And Emma's hands were shaking, and tears were streaming down her face, and she whispered, "I'm someone who failed once." And she said I wasn't going to fail again, and they rushed Brian to the hospital right away, and the paramedics said he was stable now but he needed observation and more tests, and Mr. Hudson turned back before climbing into the ambulance, and he said to Emma, "Come with us please." And in that exact moment Emma knew that everything was about to change completely. The truth would come out about Patricia, about the poisoning, about who Emma really was and what she had been hiding. And the shadows she had been hiding in for 8 whole years were about to flood with bright light, and the hospital was so bright, way too bright with its fluorescent lights, and Brian was in a room down the hall, and he was stable and sleeping, and doctors were running tests trying to understand exactly what had happened to him, and Emma sat in the waiting area with her hands still shaking, and her uniform was still damp from the pool deck, and Mr. Hudson was pacing back and forth, unable to sit still, and finally he stopped right in front of her. And he asked, "How did you know?" And his voice was quiet and broken, and Emma looked up at him, at this man who had lost his wife, who was about to lose his son, who had absolutely no idea what was happening in his own home, and she took a deep breath, and she said, "I think someone in your house has been poisoning Brian," and the words just hung in the air between them, and Mr. Hudson's face went completely white, and he said, "What?" And Emma said, "I don't have solid proof yet, but I've been watching very carefully." And she said, "Brian's been getting sick for months now, always after meals, always after bottles that Patricia prepared herself, and she said I saw her one morning putting something into his formula, something from a small vial, and his hands clenched into tight fists, and he said, 'Patricia,' and Emma said, 'I saved one of the bottles, it's in my room, hidden in my closet.'" And Mr. Hudson pulled out his phone immediately, and he called hospital security, and then he called the police. And within an hour Detective Morrison arrived at the hospital, and Emma told him absolutely everything, the pattern of Brian's illnesses, what she had seen, the bottle she had saved as evidence, and the detective asked, "Where is Patricia now?" And Mr. Hudson said quietly, "She's here at the hospital," and he said she came with the ambulance, and he said she was worried about Brian, and Detective Morrison's jaw tightened. And they found Patricia in the hospital lobby sitting calmly and perfectly composed like nothing was wrong, and Detective Morrison walked up to her, and he said, "Patricia Albright," and she said yes, and he said, "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Brian Hudson," and for the very first time her calm mask cracked and broke, and she said, "Attempted murder," and her voice was cold and sharp, and she said, "That man killed my sister, he deserves to suffer," and Mr. Hudson stepped forward, and his face looked destroyed, and he said, "What are you talking about?" And Patricia spat out the name Jennifer, and she said, "My baby sister," and she said, "You let her die, you were too busy with your precious company to notice she was bleeding out, too important to be in the room with her when she needed you," and Mr. Hudson said, "I was on a phone call in the next room, I found her, I called 911, I tried to save her," and Patricia's voice broke and got raw, and she said, "You tried too late." And years of grief were pouring out of her, and she said she died alone because you weren't there with her, and she said, "And you get to keep everything, your company, your money, your life, while she's gone forever," and Mr. Hudson said, "So you tried to kill my son," and Patricia's eyes were wild and crazy looking, and she said, "I wanted you to understand, to lose everything like I did, to feel that pain, and Detective Morrison pulled her arms behind her back, and he read her rights out loud. And as they led her away she was screaming, "You killed her, you killed Jennifer," and the words echoed through the hospital hallway, and Mr. Hudson just stood there frozen in place, and Emma saw it clearly in his face, the guilt, the weight he had been carrying for 2 whole years, and after Patricia was gone Mr. Hudson turned to Emma, and he said quietly, "I need to show you something," and they went to a small office in the hospital, and he pulled up a file on his phone, medical records, and an audio file, and he said, "This is from the night Jennifer died," and he pressed play, and Emma heard his voice from 2 years ago, younger, panicked, broken, and he was saying, "She's not breathing, there's so much blood, please you have to help her." And the 911 operator sounded calm and professional, and she said, "Sir, I need you to start CPR right now," and he said, I'm doing it, please, please, she's everything to me, please save her." And Emma could hear sirens in the background, and she could hear paramedics arriving, but they were too late, and then the medical examiner's report came up on the screen, and it said catastrophic postpartum hemorrhage, which means bleeding after having a baby, and it said unpredictable and unpreventable. And it said nothing anyone could have done would have saved her, and Mr. Hudson's hands were shaking as he turned off the recording, and he whispered, "I've lived with the guilt for 2 whole years, wondering if I had been in the room instead of on that phone call, wondering if I could have seen the signs earlier, wondering if I could have saved her somehow." And he looked at Emma with eyes that were red and raw from crying, and he said, "Patricia built a conspiracy out of her grief, she convinced herself I was a monster. And she almost murdered my son because of it," and Emma's throat got tight, and she could barely speak, and Mr. Hudson said quietly, "But there's more to this story," and he said, "Jenny, she was part of it too, and I need to know why." And Jenny was sitting in the waiting room when the police brought her in for questioning, and her face was pale and empty-looking, and tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she looked like she hadn't stopped crying since the ambulance left the house. And Detective Morrison sat down across from her at a table, and Emma and Mr. Hudson watched through the glass window, and the detective said gently, "Tell me the truth, Jenny. How long have you been involved in this?" And Jenny's hands shook really badly, and she said, 14 months, ever since Patricia found me." And the detective said, "Found you?" And Jenny wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and she said, "I did one of those DNA tests, the kind you send away in the mail just for fun. And she said I was adopted as a baby, and I always wondered about my birth parents my whole life." And Mr. Hudson's face changed like something just clicked in his brain, and Jenny continued talking, and she said the results came back with a match, a close relative, and the name was Edward Hudson, and Emma's breath caught in her throat, and Jenny whispered, "I reached out to him, and she said he was kind but cautious, and she said he told me he needed time, that he wanted to build a relationship slowly, that Brian was so young and he didn't want to confuse things," and her voice broke into pieces, and she said, "I understood, but it hurt so much," and she said, "I'd spent my whole life wondering who my father was, and when I finally found him he asked me to wait." And the detective said, "So Patricia approached you," and Jenny nodded her head, and she said, "She found me through the same DNA website, and she said she saw the connection between us, and she told me she was Jennifer's sister. And she said that Edward had caused Jennifer's death, that he was neglecting Brian, just like he had neglected Jennifer." And Jenny sobbed, and she said, "Patricia told me that if Brian was gone, Edward would finally see me, acknowledge me, that I would be his only child, his heir, that we would finally be a real family." And the detective said quietly, "So you poisoned him?" And Jenny said, "She gave me the doses, she told me exactly how much to use, and she said it would just make him sick, weaken him over time. And she said it was justice for what Edward did to Jennifer." And Jenny looked up with eyes that were red and swollen, and she said, "But when I looked at Brian, all I saw was a little boy who just wanted to be loved, just like me, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't give him the final dose, I just couldn't." And Mr. Hudson stood on the other side of the glass window with tears streaming down his face, and he whispered, "She's my daughter, I have a daughter," and Emma's heart broke into pieces for him. And Edward opened the door and walked into the room, and he sat down across from Jenny at the table, and she looked up at him terrified, and she said, I'm so sorry," and she said, "I was angry and desperate, and Patricia twisted everything, and I almost killed your son, I almost killed my brother, and Edward reached across the table and took her hands in his, and he said I should have told you sooner, and his voice was breaking, and he said I was scared, I had just lost Jennifer. I was drowning in grief, and when you reached out I didn't know how to be a father to you when I was barely holding it together for Brian. And he squeezed her hands tight, and he said, but that's not your fault, and what Patricia did, manipulating your pain, using your need for family as a weapon, that's not your fault either. And Jenny just wept and wept, and the detective granted her immunity, which means she wouldn't go to jail if she gave full testimony against Patricia in court. And later that night Emma sat alone in a hospital hallway, and Brian was going to be okay. The tests had confirmed he had protein sensitivity, which could be treated with diet changes and being careful about what he ate, and Patricia would face trial and probably go to prison, and Jenny would get therapy to help her heal, and Edward would rebuild his life and his family. But what about Emma? What would happen to her? And Mr. Hudson found her sitting there, and he sat down beside her on the uncomfortable plastic chairs, and he said, I know who you are. And Emma's heart stopped beating for a second, and he pulled out a folder from his briefcase, and he said, Emma Davis, University of Washington Medical School, withdrew in 2016 after your brother Michael died, and she couldn't speak, she couldn't say a single word, and he pulled out another folder. And he said, I want to offer you something, and he said, I'm funding a fellowship at the University of Washington Medical School, and he said it's for rare pediatric emergency conditions, and he said, I want you to finish your degree and become a doctor. And Emma just stared at him, and she said, I can't, I failed Michael. And Edward said firmly but kindly, you were 20 years old, you were a student, not a doctor, you didn't fail him, the system failed him, but you've carried his memory for 8 years. And when the moment came you saved my son, and he pulled out a photo from his pocket, and it was Brian smiling and holding up a crayon drawing of a woman with curly hair, and at the bottom were the words Dr. Elizabeth scribbled in a child's handwriting. And Edward said, you're not defined by the person you couldn't save. And he said, you're defined by the person you did save, and all the people you're going to save in the future when you stop running away. And Emma's hands trembled as she looked at the drawing. And she whispered, what if I'm not ready? And Edward said, you saved Brian when 5 trained paramedics couldn't, and he said, you're ready, and you won't be alone, I promise. And 6 months later Emma walked into her first day back at medical school wearing scrubs instead of a maid's uniform, carrying textbooks instead of cleaning supplies, walking toward a future instead of running from a past. And she was still scared, she still carried Michael's memory with her every single day, but she wasn't running anymore. She had stopped running, and Edward had kept his promise to her. He had sold the huge riverside mansion because there were too many ghosts living there, and he bought a smaller house near the lake where Brian could play outside safely, where the air didn't feel so heavy and dark, and Edward traveled much less now. He was present in ways he had never been before, learning to be the father that both of his children needed him to be, and Jenny was healing too. She went to therapy 3 times every week, and she had enrolled in college, and she was building a relationship with Brian, half-sister to little brother, slowly and carefully and with love. And Patricia was serving 12 years in prison with mandated counseling, and she was finally beginning to process Jennifer's death without blame, just pure grief. And Brian, sweet little Brian, he was thriving and growing, he was almost 3 years old now. And he was healthy and loud and full of energy like a normal toddler should be, and the Marcus Davis Pediatric Center was under construction, and it was named after Emma's brother Michael. And it would be a place dedicated to understanding rare childhood conditions, and on the wall of Emma's new apartment hung 3 photographs that she looked at every single morning. The first was Michael at 12 years old grinning in their Alabama backyard before he got sick, the second was Brian at 2 years old covered in birthday cake and laughing, and the third was her grandmother holding the green bottle that had become a bridge between old wisdom and new medicine. And Emma looked at these 3 photos every single morning to remind herself that pain has purpose, that the things we carry in the darkness prepare us for moments in the light, that sometimes God breaks us just enough to reshape us into exactly who we need to be. And she had spent 8 years believing that she had failed Michael, but the truth was simpler and more beautiful than that. Michael's death had taught her what to look for in a medical emergency, the green bottle had kept that knowledge alive and ready. And Brian's life was the proof that nothing is wasted, not the grief, not the guilt, not the years of running from city to city. All of it led to that exact moment on a pool deck when a child stopped breathing and a maid became a healer, and Emma picked up her bag full of medical textbooks, and she headed to class ready to save the next child, and the one after that. And the one after that, because she wasn't invisible anymore. She was exactly who she was always meant to be, and Michael, somewhere beyond all the pain and sadness, was finally proud of his big sister, and Emma knew deep in her heart that she would spend the rest of her life making sure that no parent would ever have to feel what her mother felt, that no child would die when there was knowledge that could save them, and she walked into that medical school building with her head held high, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that God doesn't waste our pain, He saves it, shapes it, and uses it to save others. And as the automatic doors closed behind her, Emma smiled for the first time in 8 years, a real smile, a smile that said, "I'm home, I'm finally home." And somewhere in the pediatric wing of a nearby hospital, little Brian was laughing and playing with toy trucks, his blue eyes bright and full of life, completely unaware that the woman who had saved him was about to save hundreds more just like him, and the green bottle, the one that had traveled with Emma from Alabama to Georgia to Colorado to Oregon to Washington, that bottle now sat in a medical research lab being studied by scientists, because the old wisdom of grandmothers combined with modern medicine was creating something new, something that could help children all over the world. And Patricia sat in her prison cell finally understanding that revenge had nearly destroyed an innocent child, and she wrote letters to Edward every week, letters that said "I'm sorry," letters that he sometimes read and sometimes couldn't bear to open, but he kept them all, because forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. And Jenny sat in her college classroom learning about early childhood development, determined to help children the right way this time, through love and education and care. And when she visited Brian every weekend, they would play together. And she would tell him stories, and he would call her Jen, and her heart would fill up with love instead of bitterness. And Edward sat in his office looking at a photo of Jennifer, his beautiful wife who had died too young, and instead of guilt he felt gratitude, gratitude for the time they had together, gratitude for the son she gave him, gratitude for the daughter he didn't know existed, and he whispered to the photo, "I'm doing better, Jen, I'm really trying." And he imagined she would be proud of him, proud of how he had protected Brian, proud of how he had given Jenny a second chance, proud of how he had given Emma the opportunity to heal. And as the sun set over the city of Riverside, Washington, the sky turned pink and orange and purple, and somewhere in that city a little boy was safe, a young woman was healing, a father was present, and a medical student was studying late into the night, reading about rare conditions and emergency treatments, and all the ways that knowledge could save lives. And Emma's textbook was highlighted and marked up with notes in the margins, and her green pen, the same color as the bottle, wrote down insights and observations and questions. And when she got to the chapter on FBIS, on food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome, she wrote in big letters at the top, "For Michael, for Brian, for every child who needs someone to see what others miss." And she thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how 8 years ago she had dropped out of medical school because she couldn't save her brother, and now she was back in medical school because she had saved someone else's brother, someone else's son, and the circle was complete, broken and then mended, lost and then found. And Emma closed her textbook and looked out her apartment window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness, and she made a promise to herself, to Michael, to Brian, to every child who would come after, that she would never stop learning, never stop fighting, never stop believing that every single life was worth saving. And when she finally fell asleep that night, she dreamed of Michael, and in the dream he was healthy and whole, and he was smiling at her, and he said, "I'm proud of you, Emma, I always knew you would do great things." And she woke up with tears on her cheeks but peace in her heart, because she knew now that she hadn't failed him, she had honored him, and everything she would do from this moment forward, every child she would save, every parent she would comfort, every medical breakthrough she would contribute to, all of it would be because of Michael, because of what he taught her, Because of the love that doesn't end when someone dies but instead transforms into something bigger and more powerful than we could ever imagine. And as the sun rose on a new day, Emma got dressed in her scrubs, grabbed her stethoscope, picked up her bag, and walked out the door ready to save lives. Ready to make a difference, ready to be the doctor she was always meant to be, and the green bottle sat on her shelf, a reminder of where she came from, and the photo of Michael sat beside it, a reminder of why she was doing this, and the drawing from Brian hung on her wall, a reminder of what she had already accomplished, and together these three objects told the story of transformation, of how pain can become purpose, of how loss can become love, of how failure can become strength. And Emma smiled as she walked down the street toward the hospital, where she would do her clinical rotation, because she finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to teach her all those years ago, when she showed her how to make that medicine, that sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from forgetting our pain but from remembering it, from carrying it with us, from letting it shape us into people who can help others. And as Emma pushed through the hospital doors and began her shift, she carried with her the weight of Michael's memory, the joy of Brian's laughter, the wisdom of her grandmother's teachings, and the hope of every child who would one day need someone like her, someone who had failed before and knew exactly how much it hurt, someone who had been broken and knew exactly how to heal, someone who had run away and finally found the courage to come home. And the baby who had stopped breathing that day on the pool deck was now a thriving 3-year-old who would grow up never knowing how close he came to death, never knowing that a maid with a secret had saved his life, never knowing that his father's guilt and his aunt's revenge and his sister's desperation had all collided in one terrible moment, but he would grow up loved and safe and protected, and sometimes, when he was older, his father would tell him the story of the woman who saved him, and Brian would listen with wide eyes and ask if he could meet her. And Edward would smile and say she's Dr. Davis now, and she saves children every single day. And maybe one day when you're older she'll tell you her story, and Brian would nod and go back to playing, not understanding yet how much he owed to a woman he barely remembered. But one day he would understand, one day when he was older and had children of his own, he would understand that love sometimes looks like a maid who risked everything to save a child who wasn't hers. And he would tell his own children about the importance of courage and sacrifice, and doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. And the story would live on, passed down through generations, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that hidden knowledge can save lives, that failure isn't final, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes God places us in exactly the right place at exactly the right time for exactly the right purpose. And Emma never forgot that truth. Not when she graduated at the top of her medical school class, not when she accepted her first job at a children's hospital, not when she published her first research paper on FBIS, not when she won awards and recognition and praise, because she knew that all of it, every single bit of it, was built on the foundation of Michael's death and Brian's life, and she carried both of them with her always, in her heart, in her work, in her purpose. And when medical students would ask her years later why she chose pediatric emergency medicine, why she specialized in rare conditions, why she worked such long hours and never seemed to get tired, she would tell them about a little boy in Alabama who died because nobody knew what was wrong, and about a little boy in Washington who lived because somebody did, and she would tell them that the difference between those two outcomes was knowledge and courage and the willingness to speak up even when you're scared, and the students would listen and take notes and feel inspired. And some of them would go on to save lives because Emma had saved lives, because Michael had died, because Brian had lived, because everything is connected, every pain, every loss, every triumph, every joy, all of it woven together into the beautiful complicated tapestry of human existence. And Emma understood this better than most, understood that we are all carrying something, all running from something, all hoping for something, and that our job is to take what we've been given, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, and transform them into something good, something useful, something that helps others. And as she walked through the hospital hallways years later, now Dr. Emma Davis, respected and admired, she would sometimes see a maid cleaning or a janitor working, and she would always stop and say hello, always treat them with respect and kindness, because she remembered what it was like to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be the person nobody noticed. And she never wanted anyone to feel that way ever again, and the hospital staff loved her for this. Loved her for her humility and compassion, loved her for the way she treated everyone the same regardless of their job or status, and parents whose children she saved would hug her and cry and ask how they could ever thank her, and she would always say the same thing. She would say love them, protect them, and if you ever see someone who needs help, help them, because that's how we honor the gift of life. And the parents would nod and promise. And they would go home and hold their children a little tighter, and they would tell their friends about the amazing doctor who saved their child, and the story would spread, and more families would come, and more children would be saved, and the ripple effect of that one moment on that pool deck would continue to expand outward, touching more and more lives, creating more and more hope, and somewhere in all of this, Michael was smiling, because his death had not been meaningless. His loss had not been for nothing. He had taught his sister the most important lesson she would ever learn, and because of that, hundreds of children would live, would laugh, would grow up to have their own children and tell their own stories, and the green bottle that started it all, the one Emma's grandmother had taught her to make, was now replicated in hospitals around the country, updated with modern ingredients but based on the same principle. And medical journals published articles about the effectiveness of combining traditional remedies with modern medicine, and Emma's name was at the top of those articles. Dr. Emma Davis, pioneer in integrative pediatric emergency medicine, and she kept every article in a box under her bed, not out of pride but out of gratitude, because she never forgot where she came from, never forgot the maid's uniform and the hidden bottle and the desperate prayer that she wouldn't fail again. And she didn't fail, she succeeded. She thrived, she became everything she was meant to be, and the final truth. The deepest truth, the truth that Emma would carry with her until her own last breath, was this: that pain is not the end of the story, it's the beginning, that loss does not define us, it refines us, that the moments when we feel most broken are often the moments when God is preparing us for our greatest purpose, and that little boy who stopped breathing on a warm Saturday afternoon in October, who turned blue while his father screamed and guests panicked and paramedics failed, that little boy lived because his maid carried a secret, because his father chose to trust, because his sister chose to confess, because everyone in that moment chose courage over fear, truth over lies, action over paralysis. And years later, when Brian Hudson graduated from college, when he started his own family, when he became a father himself, he would sit with his children and tell them the story of Dr. Emma Davis. And he would explain that heroes don't always wear capes, sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they're invisible, sometimes they're the people we overlook, and his children would listen wide-eyed, and they would ask if the story was true, and Brian would smile and say every single word, and he would take them to visit Emma, now elderly but still sharp, still kind, still working part-time at the hospital because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. And Emma would greet them warmly, and show them the old green bottle displayed in a case in her office, and she would show them the photo of Michael, forever 12, forever smiling, and she would show them the crayon drawing Brian had made when he was 2, Dr. Elizabeth spelled wrong but meaning everything, and the children would understand then that this was a true story, a real story, a story about their grandfather Brian and about the woman who saved him, and they would feel something shift inside them, something important, something that would stay with them forever. The understanding that every person has value, that every life matters, that we never know when our moment will come, the moment when we're called to be brave, to speak up, to save someone. And Emma would tell them in her gentle elderly voice that she hoped they would never need to make the choice she made. But if they did, she hoped they would remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite the fear. And the children would nod solemnly, and they would hug Emma goodbye, and they would leave feeling changed, feeling inspired, feeling like they too could be heroes someday. And as the sun set on Emma's long and meaningful life, as she lay in bed surrounded by photos and memories and the love of people whose lives she had touched, she would close her eyes and see Michael one last time, and he would be smiling, and he would say, "Welcome home, Emma, you did good, you did so good," and she would smile too, and she would whisper, I I finally know, and she would take her last breath with peace in her heart, knowing that her pain had purpose, that her running had led her home, that her failure had become her greatest success. And that the baby who stopped breathing all those years ago was now a grandfather telling her story to children who would tell it to their children, and on forever, because some stories never die, they just transform, like pain into purpose, like fear into courage, like a maid into a healer, and somewhere in heaven or whatever comes after, Emma and Michael were together again, and this time nobody was crying, everybody was smiling, because the circle was complete, the story was finished, and love, as always, had won.